But didn't you
Oh, they've never seen it. My
Didn't you
boys.
take them as the kids when they were learning to walk and stuff like that? I brought them.
No.
I appreciate your sharing.
Of course you were.
So you obviously have a lot of pictures or books or materials that show that actual original.
Excited to see all of you, and I know that a lot of you have been involved in different exhibits and different restoration projects around here over the years, so I'm the newbie on the block in this room. So I just wanted to take a couple of minutes to thank Vicki and Roseanne and Amanda for putting tonight together. You guys have been champs, and this is lovely. I also want to just take a couple of minutes to talk a little bit about what brought this exhibit about. It had nothing to do with me. There's someone who's not here tonight that I think most of you know, who's really been a core part of why we have the exhibit, but also how we came to get a lot of the content that drives it. Most of you, I think, know Judy Bentley, one of our past presidents. This exhibit is the final step in a multi-grant, many-year project called Telling Our Westside Stories. Judy is a professional local historian who's also recently retired as a professor of history at South Seattle College, the author of many history books, and including a couple of recent releases. She's been an author in what is the name of our speaker series?
Wonders of West Seattle.
Thank you. Judy did a project, a couple rounds of a project, taking oral histories of local folks, but working with middle school students to teach them, and to teach them the skill of doing oral histories, which is a pretty finessed skill to have, and one that I think a lot of us adults would struggle to do well. These kids did amazing work. She also was teaching them how to have a higher stake in their community and to really value what it is that makes their community unique and special, and to preserve local history because of what it means to that. So the three big themes that have been involved with this Telling Our Westside Story were land, work, and home. The first exhibit that went up with these was, of course, the land one. And the oral histories that were done really aligned with each of these three themes. So the land exhibit talked a lot about, the shape of the Duwamish Peninsula and the earthquakes and a lot of the more geographical effects. Work was the one that was put up when I first started here. It was up, I think, for about a year and a half with the help of Sarah Balinson, my predecessor. She did a great job in really bringing a lot of the local businesses to life, talking about the things that people had done for work over the years. And then now we have home. And we've tweaked it a little bit. This is welcome home. We really wanted to focus on the idea that your community is a nurturing, welcoming place, or ideally it is. And in that idea of home, there's a lot of sociological concepts. Your house is your home, but your home is also where a lot of us derive a certain part of our self-identity from. And the way that we shape our home, we certainly express ourselves through the colors we paint the walls. Do we choose to have a yard or not? Is it a lawn? Is it a native plant garden? All these different things, they're really reaching out of ourselves and showing our community who we are. Who do we see ourselves as becoming? There was an interesting article that I read in the Atlantic a while back that dealt with this idea of home and kind of looking at the more westernized notions versus more easternized notions of the concept of home. And what we want to call the West in this moment, I guess, looks at, you take home with you. Wherever you go, you create your home, and you can create a new space, and you can change your home. This is something that is on a continuum of how does your life change over time. And if you go back to those earlier homes, how some of those earlier parts of yourself might actually come out a little bit more. I don't know if any of you have had that experience, that whole idea that you can't go home again, but then you still kind of try. Mm-hmm. There's another notion of home that is more commonly found in a lot of the Asian countries, a lot of the Eastern philosophies, that is that home is actually the connection between you and the place where you are. And so there's a much deeper attachment in some ways to the physical space that you're in. I think whether you agree if that's an east-west notion or if that's a difference in those types of cultural exchanges, I think here in West Seattle and the Duwamish Peninsula, we're actually very much in that second idea of home. There was a recent article in the Seattle Times that looked at, they were data mining. They were looking at some of the census information, and they discovered that if you define geographic diversity as people who are living in a state that they weren't born in, Seattle is the 4th most geographically diverse city in the country. But within Seattle, the Fauntleroy neighborhood is the least geographically diverse. So we're really in an interesting place here. You know, people love living here. They don't leave. And when new people come, they tend to stick too. We have a lot of new people who are coming in right now. So there's a lot of new landing stories that are being created constantly. And I'm one of those people, and I have found it to be very welcome. But a lot of the things that the exhibit is looking at is both the idea of, you know, if your house is your home and it's what you put into it, there's also the social context and the social issues that affect what kind of experience you have of your home. So I'll really quickly touch a little bit on what's actually in the exhibit now that I've kind of gone through some of the bigger ideas that were driving the exhibit. Ellie Kleinwort is the designer that worked with us on this. She is a fabulous graphic designer, and she's done a lot of work. There will be some more things that are still coming in. Unfortunately, Ellie had the flu this week, so we weren't able to finish tweaking a couple of things. But as we come in and we start to look around the room, the exhibit kind of proceeds kind of from above the fireplace, around, and into the next room. And it's, as we start over here, you've got a little bit of that earliest history of the log house itself and its relationship with the fir lodge. One of the items that we have on the table right here, this is one of my favorite items in our collections. And this was discovered pretty recently. Well, discovered by me, but I think people have known it was here for a while. This is one of the original rugs that was in the fir lodge and had been owned by William and Gladys Bernard. They are the family that built our log house museum as the carriage house to their estate. So this rug actually goes back quite a ways. We're in the process of building a mount for it, and it will be mounted up over the fireplace right here, but I wanted to give you guys a chance to get to see what it was. And it's pretty large, which is why we're not able to unroll it all the way. I think it still has some of that early sediment on it as well. And then as you go around the fireplace itself, we have this great quote from Marcy, our current board president, in one of the oral histories that was pulled out about how this cabinet came to be built. It was actually the process of adapting to earthquake damage. And I think, Marcy, what you said in the oral history, and you can correct this if I got it wrong, is that that was where her mother kept some of the special dishes, and the family table would have been right in this space right here. And then as we go around, because we've already been touching on the earthquake damage a little bit, there's a little bit more about what it's like to live with a home that's near a fault line, or you live with natural disasters and things that are outside of your control that can really affect your physical sense of your home and your physical safety. And that sense of well-being that is what we look for in a home. So we've got some photos from some different parts of the peninsula. We have Frank Doty here in the middle. After that same earthquake in 1965, I think it was, that damaged our log house chimney, Frank Doty's family home where he was born was damaged beyond repair. And the city actually caused him to have to pull it down. So we're looking a little bit at that idea, the deep sense of loss when your home is gone. But the Doty family continues to live in that South Park area. So there is a deep rootedness that extends well beyond your house. We also have here a really early image of a home that was part of the West Seattle Land and Improvement Company. They're responsible for a lot of the early platting of what is now the North Admiral neighborhood. There's a map a plat map that you've probably seen on an easel back there that is the original, it's a copy of the original platting of the North Admiral neighborhood. For a handful of years, that area was actually its own town, and that is where West Seattle comes from. The down below and over here on Alki Beach, so down below the cliff along Harbor Avenue, all along Alki Beach here, Beach Drive, these areas were all separate little communities, little hamlets. And so when we look at the character of Seattle, we have all these little neighborhoods that are really vibrant, really strong in their individual identity. Thinking about home, yeah, Seattle is our hometown. But really, that sense of Fauntleroy, like why have so few people left Fauntleroy? It's because that little hamlet identity is still there and it's really strong. Not only was West Seattle its own town from, I think it was 1905 to 1907, so not, or
02 to 07.
just 5 years. West Seattle had its own town, and then where the steel mill is, Nucor Steel, that was its own town called Cooperstown. We have the Cooperstown Cultural Arts Center, which comes out of that. So we still have these remnants of those really early little hometowns that everybody was living in. Even over here we have the village of Alki along the beachfront here. It was a separate village of South Alki along Beach Drive. So a couple of these different little hamlets, some of them were officially incorporated. A lot of that changed very rapidly in 1907 when the city annexed huge areas. But because of our peninsula, it didn't mean that that character was driven out. Those little hamlets, those little towns still kept very strong. We've got in this corner, I won't go too much into detail on a lot of them, but the idea is that looking at the way that housing trends change over time, they reflect something about what's happening in your socioeconomic landscape. You know, what are the building materials made out of? Probably reflects what was cheap and easy. When this estate was built, the Fur Lodge estate, there was a lot of lumber. This area was heavily forested. That was a relatively easy thing to get your hands on, and it was old growth lumber. Well, the reason we don't build these awesome rustic cabin type structures too much anymore, lumber's a lot harder to come by like that. We don't have that access to old growth. For us to do that kind of maintenance on this building takes quite a lot of money. So it's changed, and we look at the way the building materials have changed all through until today we see a lot of very similar building styles going up. Well, whether you like them or not, that bright orange hardy board that you see on some of the newer structures is going to mean the same thing for future generations that the old growth logs may mean for us, or that the craftsman style homes mean for us or for our parents or for our grandparents. Of course, I'll leave Marcy to be the expert on what it was like to live in the log house. She was fortunate, she was kind enough to share with us in our collections book. We have a little bit of video here of Marcy's first communion. And I am obsessed over that dress. I'm so charmed. And so you can see that there are a couple of features that are a little bit different. Yep. This video is a great documentary piece, not just about our building, but about our little corner of the neighborhood. Was it your dad that was shooting this? He did an amazing job of really panning all of it and taking in the detail. We have this record.
I have to ask, what prompted him to do this at this thing? Was it your communion?
Yeah.
And just getting the whole neighborhood was, yeah?
Yeah, I think, so we have actually quite a bit of 8mm film, so
Yeah.
this is one of the, yeah.
It's the 50s.
Yeah.
It's when everybody was
Well,
doing
we definitely
50s and
have
60s,
an
yeah.
interest
50s
in
and
preserving
60s,
this
yeah.
kind of film because as you
Yeah.
can tell, this is
Fabulous.
a copy of a copy. And so that 8mm film that her dad took is still going to have the sharpest images, and it's going to be the best thing to be
I
preserved.
still have it.
Let me know if you want any tips on preservation.
That probably would be a good idea, yeah.
Yeah.
Right now they're in a tin, you know, they're spliced in a tin.
Those are usually good housing.
Yeah.
love it.
As we go around, there's one photo that's missing over here. We wanted to make sure that we talked about our earliest people, our earliest neighbors that would have been on the peninsula, and that's the Duwamish tribe. I think a lot of people here are very familiar with the current story of the Duwamish tribe. They're here, they're fighting for federal recognition. They've built a new longhouse over not too far distant from where some of their earlier longhouses were. But when we were looking for an early image of the longhouse, it was incredible how difficult that search was. That early Duwamish history, various agencies, and when I say agency, I don't mean specifically government, but various agencies worked very hard to eradicate the culture of Duwamish people, to the extent that we've only been able to find one photo of a Duwamish longhouse, and we only recently discovered it in Oregon. So we don't even have one at Mohi, we don't have one at the University of Washington. There's one photo of a Duwamish longhouse on the Cedar River. So that will be joining this little display shortly. But one of the things about the displacement that I think isn't well recognized is that it actually started even before those early pioneer settlers landed on the beach. Before that time, in the preceding probably about 10 years, there had been a huge smallpox epidemic, and it had killed thousands of people. And so when the settlers landed on the beach, they encountered a much diminished Duwamish tribe who was startled and afraid and feeling very, very down. A lot of people wonder, why were they so open and so helpful to these people who were coming into their land? These people that just spread like crazy. Well, they were looking for some protection too. So there's a long history of all the different relationships among the early tribes. It goes back millennium. And so in those relationships, power is waxed and waned, much like between any nations on earth. In that time period, where so many people had died inexplicably, they moved into what they saw as a protection environment. If they moved in and supported these white people who would come in some ways it kept the other tribes at bay. So there was a good reason for them to go out, and actually about 200 of them, Arthur Denny said about 200 of them met them on the beach. And when they landed, the Denny party, or the Alki landing party as we prefer to say here, actually landed around Duwamish Head. It wasn't right out in front here where the cabin got built. They landed around the mouth where there were several Duwamish settlements already in place. So they could have seen those houses when they landed. They knew that there were people here. Arthur Denny said that there were about 1,000 Duwamish living in the mouth of the river. There were a couple of different little settlements. There was Herring's house is the most well-known one, and one of the things that confused me at first, Herring's house was the name of the village. It wasn't just the house. There were about 8 houses there. The one longhouse was the big civic center. People lived in it, but it was kind of, as your family got bigger, you needed another house because the extended family lived together. So you started with the one big house, and you had another house and another house. They had 8 houses just at that one site. There was another little one just over across the river in an area that is now gone, but it's Port of Seattle land. There were a couple of these different little ones, and they got to be more people as you moved up the Duwamish River. The largest concentration of the Duwamish population was between the Cedar and Black Rivers over in the Renton area. So that's the environment that the Denny's and the Lows and the Terrys landed in. And so they were looking for a new home, and the Duwamish welcomed them into their home. So as more people came in looking for homes, there was a huge expansion of growth. The West Seattle Land Improvement Company was responsible for platting out the North Admiral neighborhood, as I mentioned, but they were also responsible for certain acts that directly displaced the last of the Duwamish longhouses and the people who lived in them. The way that they found out about the burning of the 8 longhouses, which were the last longhouses directly in the Seattle vicinity, was that they were going, I think it was Henry Yesler, I'll have to double check that, but they were going by Harbor Island on a boat and saw all of these Duwamish people there who looked just especially miserable. And was like, why are they out here? Well, it had been about a week since their houses had been burned. And it is the only recorded burning of longhouses. Even though this had been thing that had happened, and there had been other longhouses in the area that had already been burned and gone. This is the only one where it was actually recorded. And they have the name of the person that they believe did it.
So they were arson.
It was arson, and it was pretty much to make West Seattle more attractive to people to move here. It was really based on development. It's a really sad fact, but the Duwamish are still here. And they're still fighting for recognition. Our organization, the Southwest Seattle Historical Society, our board has passed resolutions highly in support of the Duwamish, and so we're not afraid of that. We're excited for them, and we think that it's a continuing partnership that began with those first settlers and those first Duwamish folks. Not the first Duwamish folks. So as we go around a little bit, we had another artifact in the collection that I have just been fascinated by. It's this high chair. And it's from the Coleman family, which is another family name that a lot of longtime Seattleites will recognize, from the Coleman dock and the Coleman pool. And if you've been fortunate enough to go out to the Coleman estate, it's beautiful. This is the family high chair. And I don't know if any of your guys' families have these traditions, but on the bottom of the high chair tray, if you get a chance to look at it, scrawled very finely, are the names and the dates of all the kids that use the chair. And this is not a unique feature. There's actually one of our neighbors around here recently purchased a high chair at a garage sale, where the original family that owned that chair had done the same thing for about 8 generations. Wow. Which is really incredible. She said that she'll give us the high chair when her baby's out of it. But that's kind of just an artifact that relates to, again, to more of the family traditions and what makes a home and people staying in place for a long time. As we go through here, this section over here really digs more, again, into some of the social issues around the idea of home. Who gets to have a home and what pushes them out of it. There are a couple of big things that came out of housing pressure, and it kind of tends to bring those issues to a tumultuous forefront. World Wars, World War I and II, both caused some significant housing crunches. The First World War caused the first government intervention in this area in the housing market. The local government set up free rental agencies to help people find places to live, because so many people coming in to work at Boeing and so few places to go. Boeing played a much bigger part in the war growth that happened with World War II. There were huge numbers of people coming, not just to work in the Boeing plants, but also all of the defense workers who actually worked for the government. There were government housing projects that were set up in South Park, White Center, and High Point. And so here we have a picture of the High Point housing projects. We had some really interesting oral history comments that came out, kind of talking about what was it like to be a kid who was here. And I'm going to just read this quote out to you. As soon as they built those projects, the fence worker housing, my parents put up a picket fence, and I was told to play inside the fence. Anyone that moved in was perceived as not real welcome. They were new. If you lived here and you had your own house, then you took care of the place. You cared. Those people that lived in temporary housing, they were not well liked by and large, regardless. I think that that is a really incredible thing for this is Patty Schill. It's really an incredible thing for her to have said. And it's amazing that we were able to have this in our history, because I think this theme is never going away. This is one that it recurs every time you have long-held community feeling and significant change. And I think that that's one that is very prominent right now in our civic discourse. As we build and things change, and talking about who do we want to be? Who do we want to be as a community? What kind of homes do we want to have? Both as physical structures, but as our neighborhoods. Another symptom, really, that occurred during that time period came out of the Japanese internment that accompanied World War II. Again, we have some really incredible quotes. Ruth Okada is an Alki resident. She still lives down here. I think Ruth is she 96? Ruth shared some stories with us talking about what it was like to, they had just bought an apartment building. And then the executive order came out from FDR interning all the Japanese citizens and telling them when we're to report, pretty much. So she and her husband, who were newly married and had just purchased this, it was going to be their home, but it was also going to be home for many other people. They had to lock up all of their wedding presents. They locked them up in a padlocked room, hoping, because they didn't know how long they were going to be gone, hoping that that would be enough. And sadly, while they were interned, someone, they believe it was a renter, broke in and took all their wedding presents. It's amazing that they had a building to come back to, but a lot of families didn't. Ruth took a really incredible philosophical approach to this. She said, we put a padlock in that room, but it did give a lot of time for the renters to take whatever they wanted. So there was a loss, but you know, I learned material things are not important. I mean, that is just an incredible sentiment to take out of such a significant event. One thing that happened during the period of Japanese internment, when you look at like a neighborhood like South Park prior to World War II had been a combined, largely immigrant community, mostly Italians and Japanese. They were truck farmers. From the earliest days, the truck farms in South Park are what gave rise to Pike Place Market. So when Japanese internment happened, South Park became almost entirely a Caucasian community, and that really didn't change until quite recently. So these are some of the effects that this real loss and displacement of your home had on the wider community and its lasting effects. Then kind of, we leap over a little ways and look ahead. We're going from World War II to, there wasn't huge bouts of growth on the same level as, you know, the early development period where the Duwamish was displaced, or World War I and II. There wasn't another huge housing crunch really through until kind of around today's era. But in between that time span, something very significant happened. There's probably a number of folks in the room who can remember the campaign for the Seattle Open Housing Ordinance. This was a long-fought battle when it really shouldn't have been. The Seattle Housing Ordinance basically did away with what's called redlining. A lot of you probably are familiar with that, but for those who aren't, redlining was if you are black or you're a minority, you can't live in our neighborhood. You can't buy here. Homeowners won't sell their home to you. Real estate agents won't sell homes to you. They won't work with you. And really, when you think about that idea of home, you know, it's the place where you're supposed to feel welcome and comfort. It's the place where it's you and your neighbors. It's not just your own house. You can't do it in isolation. So if you move into a neighborhood and you're very clearly told that you're not welcome, that's beyond heartbreaking. I'd like to thank Carol Ann Thornton for being here. She gave us some of really the best information about what it was like to be in the first black family to buy a house in this area. And she gave us a lot of great information too on being a student here, but we tried to focus more on the housing part of it. And incredibly, the struggles that her family went through just trying to own their own home. When you think about that growth of the middle class, that meant, oh, this is, you know, a chicken in the pot and car in the garage. It has to start with having the house. And so this time when, you know, more people were having more disposable income, more people were having the ability to purchase houses, and whole sections of society were just pretty much flat out told, you can't buy a house. I don't care how much money you have, you can't buy a house. I mean, that's really what they were facing. So some of the things that Carol Ann shared with us were really pretty moving. There was a petition that went around to keep my parents and my family away from Beach Drive. People actually put their names down. They were willing to be that forward about it. Somebody poisoned our dog. There were 4 families who moved because we were moving in. There's not a lot I can add to that. Some of the artifacts that we have up here, I was really excited to be able to pull out because they show some of the other pieces of that. I said that the fight for it was long and hard. The open housing ordinance didn't pass until 1968, but some of the earliest movements to try to change that and to try to do away with redlining, some of the earliest recorded ones were in the 1930s. So there have been people all along who've been recognizing what a terrible injustice this is and how very wrong it was. We're very fortunate here that one of our founders, Elliot Cowden, he was a real estate agent out of White Center, and he was very involved for many years in trying to help get this ordinance passed. So we have some nods to Elliot here. We've got his realtor sign. Elliot was really instrumental in working with the real estate professionals and working with the industry to try to get more realtors to voluntarily sign on and say that we sell to everybody. If you want to sell your home through us, we sell to everybody. There was a lot of resistance to that. He worked tirelessly through the churches, through city government, but other folks, remember the Colemans? Ken Coleman also worked on that. We have an artifact here that's a mailer that went out, and it's signed by Kenneth B. Coleman, chairman of the Citizens Committee for Open Housing. Here, Elliot Cowden, a local realtor, speaks on the housing ordinance. Carol, Ann, did you want to say anything? Sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
No. Actually, my parents were purchasing a second home. We already owned a home. And they were purchasing a second home and had actually put money down on a home in Mercer Island, and it was taken out from under them. The realtor was directed by his, the head of the Benton McCarthy Realty on Mercer Island, to ask the community if they wanted a Negro family in the community. This is back in 1968. And then I went to school with the Morrison children, and that's the home that my parents bought. And it was their dog that was poisoned.
Oh,
it was their
we can
dog.
fix that.
But yeah, and it was a challenge. And the rest of the story is on the video.
And for that video, you can go to our website. Carol Ann tells it in her own words and does it wonderfully.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So there's a few other things here, and I also do want to touch a little bit on where we are today. So we're in another historic housing crunch, moving forward from, So Seattle open housing that started in 1968 with eliminating redlining. It wasn't until 1975 that some more non-discrimination laws were passed in housing. And it wasn't until the 90s finally that now it's pretty much illegal to discriminate against anybody based on ethnicity, gender, sexual preferences, age, ability. It took us until the 90s. So we're always getting better. So then coming ahead to today, we're, like I said, in another historic housing crunch. And I think we can all see it and we can all feel it. You know, there are a lot of people that have moved to Seattle, and a lot of it's supported by a pretty diverse economics here. Seattle is a very wealthy city at this point in time, and it's creating some havoc in terms of how do you support the people who've already been here through perhaps less advantaged, that's not the way to say it, when it wasn't quite as wealthy. And how do we move forward? You know, some of the things that we experience are people getting priced out of the housing market. I know a lot of new families and people trying to be new homeowners who just can't win a bid. One of the city's ways of trying to deal with this is the idea of urban villages. And this comes as a piece of the 30-year comprehensive plan. This idea was thought up 30 years ago. We're in the process of redeveloping our comprehensive plan now. And the idea had been that as the city grew to try to deal with urban sprawl issues, which is what the previous generation of city governments had to acknowledge. They didn't want the centers of the cities to empty out. They didn't want them to sprawl too far into the country. So how could they try to find a place in between? They looked at the areas that had the most dense housing already, and they designated them as urban villages. So this is what would have been like our Alaska Junction. It was the area of commerce. It was the area where there was the most dense housing because there were more likely to be more apartment buildings close to it. And so zoning changes allowed for increased heights, and decreased setbacks, how far you had to be away from the sidewalk. But the growth didn't happen right when they passed those zoning changes necessarily. And nobody predicted how fast we were really going to grow. And so I think that there's been some surprises from all sides about what are the repercussions of how this was mapped out. We are required under state law as a city to plan for a certain amount of growth. And so when the city does the comprehensive plan, that's what they have to resolve. They have no choice. They have to make sure that this many housing units are built, and how can they pull that off? Well, as you change these zoning things, unintended consequences sometimes happen. And sometimes we get, you know, redevelopment in areas that we're not so sure we necessarily want to redevelop. But it kind of goes back to that idea of like, your house is your home, your house is your neighborhood, or your home is your neighborhood. You know, who gets to say how much control do you have over an individual structure or an individual home versus how that home sits in your wider community? One of the other symptoms that we have also had increase a lot with this historic housing crunch is we've had a huge uptick in homelessness. There's a statistic here that I want to read out to you. In 2016, the one night count, and this is something they've been doing for the last several years, they go out in one night and they count how many homeless people can they find. And you know the numbers are always going to be less than is actually out there. In 2016, the one night count counted 4,505 people without shelter in King County. That was a 19% increase from 2015. Whether or not that homelessness increase is caused by people being driven out of the housing market, or whether or not it's caused by how welcoming our communities are and how supportive they are and the kinds of things that they offer to people who maybe don't have their own home. There's always going to be a lot of discussion about that. But the idea of, again, if you don't have a house, this is still your home. So it's an interesting paradox for us as a community to struggle with, but really most poignantly for the people who are in the situation. Did anybody have any questions about anything in this room? I think I've been kind of talking a little while, so I don't have a great conclusion here other than we tried to just put things in the exhibit that we're going to give some food for thought. This is really a bullet points exhibit. All of these topics have so much more that could be discussed. And I'm really looking forward to looking from kind of the curatorial lens at how does our organization continue to build its collections so that we don't have situations where we can't find any proof of the people who lived here, that they had houses and they were here. How do we document the homeless as they come and go? You know, these are kind of some of the social things that being a local history organization really deals with that no one else deals with. You know, yeah, we were here. Yes, this was our home. That's a big important concept. I'd like to leave you with a little more positive thought. The next room over, I hope you'll take some time in. There's some opportunities for interaction in there. We have a touch screen up that's got the landmarks map on it. We're really interested in learning from our members and from our public. What do you want us to preserve about our home? What makes it our home? What are the characteristics that you think really should be carried forward? We're not going to be able to save everything, but let's at least have some ideas of the things that have the most intrinsic value to the community. There's also a whole basket of Post-its, because I love Post-its. And there are some questions that we think would be kind of fun to get your beat on. You know, what is it that you love about your home? Is it something about your house? Is it something about your yard? Is it something about your neighborhood? Is it something about the park by your house? We're really interested in seeing, what do you love? And what's your landing story? You know, those first settlers, they landed on the beach. We tell that landing story as a big part of what we interpret here at the Birthplace of Seattle Loghouse Museum. What is your landing story? There's new people coming in all the time, and that's a question we want to ask everybody. You know, we've got some of the most geographically diverse, some of the most ethnically diverse, and some of the least diverse neighborhoods in the city. We want to know how people got here and what caused them to stay, because those are the things that we want to continue forward with. Thank you very much for listening to me. And Meg?
I have one question about the interviews that were originally done with the students. What
Yes.
form are those in and how are those preserved? Are they transcribed or?
The interviews that the students did originally with the land, work, and home, those are transcribed. We have them in both media files, so they actually recorded them with audio equipment. And so we have the audio recordings of them, and we also have the written transcribed versions of them. We're in the process right now of scanning all of those to put them into our database so that they're easier to look through and find information so that they'll be more useful for other researchers.
Yeah, I was part of that one too.
Yeah, Caroline got in on everything. Got good stories.
Which
to
was
tell.
an honor. It was an honor because 50 years ago it wasn't like that. It wasn't like that. So being invited into and soliciting my story and the story of my parents and the legacy that they left is a great honor, and I thank everybody very, very much for that.
Well, thank you for being here and for sharing.
Thank you.
I'm sure we'll ask you to share some more stuff too.
Not a problem.
Well, thanks you guys.
Nice
Thank you
job.
for coming.
Thank you.